Hi, this is Dr. Liu to discuss playing styles, in this case, fluidity in tabletop and video games. Consider when you're designing a game, who are you designing it for? We talk about knowing your target audience, but you have to understand what kinds of things are important to a target audience. Even amongst people who like games that require thinking, they often think in quite different modes. I'm leaving out all those games that don't really require you to think. So I call these modes playing styles, and they fall into at least two sets of categories. I believe I'll have a third soon. The first is classical or romantic, which I first wrote about in the 80s and I'm not considering here. The second is about the fluidity in the game, and there are three player types: planner, adapter, and improviser. Now, what do I mean by fluidity? I'm using the word to talk about how quickly the state of the game changes. In some games, there's relatively little change from turn to turn or minute to minute or move to move. In others, there's a great deal of change in the same time frame. Players tend to have strong preferences about the fluidity of the game that they play, especially serious or hardcore players, and that's what I'm going to describe. Planners like to think well ahead, to plan their path through the entire game, even a game where there's opposition that can quite actively hinder or oppose them. You can still plan all that. You may have to change your plan as you go along, but you're always planning out to the end. At the other extreme, improvisers don't want to think ahead. They want a game where they only need to figure out what to do in the short term. And that may be in a game where so much happens, so much changes from turn to turn that planning is nigh impossible. Adapters are in between. They plan for the middle term, a few moves, a few turns, a few minutes ahead. Let's put it another way. Planners like order, and they may not care for games with lots of overt uncertainty mechanics like dice rolls. Improvisers like chaos, and may not mind games with lots of uncertainty, overt or not. Adapters, once again, are in between, kind of neutral. You can play what is naturally a planner's game, say, as an improviser, but you're unlikely to succeed. And similarly, if you're playing a game that's naturally an improviser's game and you try to be a planner, you're unlikely to succeed. Now, oddities can arise from this. For example, I'm a planner, and I used to actually say 40 years ago, I hate dice games. But my favorite game for much of the time since was Dungeons and Dragons, where there's lots of dice rolls. Nonetheless, they're dice rolls that you can plan for generally. You can use probabilities. And to me, Dungeons and Dragons is kind of a microcosm of life where you try to minimize the number of times you have to get lucky to succeed. So whether Dungeons and Dragons is a planner's game or an improviser's game or an adapter's game, it depends a lot on the referees, but you can try to play it as a planner regardless. Now, when you design a game, you're focusing on certain playing style or styles, whether you know it or not. Generally, planners want to control as much of the game as possible, which is why they dislike uncertainty mechanics. Improvisers are content to work with whatever they have. Adapters, as usual, are in between. How you design the game affects this parameter strongly. There's a type of thinking involved here that differs from one style to another. Improvisers like to use intuition rather than logic. Intuition is quick. It doesn't result in analysis paralysis, and that suits improvisation. Planners tend to rely more on logic. Logic is slower. It can result in analysis paralysis in games, especially where things change too rapidly. And once again, adapters are kind of in between. What about game length? Well, improviser games, you might suppose, are almost of necessity shorter than other kinds of games because improvisers are rarely interested in the long term. They may also fear, and I've run into people like this, that an early mistake is going to doom them in a longer game. even though a planner might see ways through a long game to make a comeback. So fewer turns are more appropriate for improvisers. Now, I have said elsewhere that you want to have stages in a game, and more stages the longer the game is. You can have an improvisation game that changes, in other words has stages, so that it can go longer, but I'd say that's fairly rare. If we look in contrast at planner games and planners, more turns or more time give planners more scope for planning. Long games are usually planners games. Long games need stages, and so we can say planner games generally need stages. If it's a long game and it doesn't change, then even a planner is going to get tired of it. Now there are lots of games that are designed to be played just once. For example, single-player video games, some story-based games, because you learn the story and then you're done. And that limits the possibilities for planners. Planners rarely have enough information to plan ahead on the first play. If you don't have a good idea of what might happen, how can you plan what you want to cause to happen? Now I'll continue this discussion in part 2.